In this video, I want to talk about the first 4 sections of your media production design, what I call the big picture sections of your folio. Now, these are not necessarily something that you have to do first, but they should appear at the front end of your folio to really set up what it is that you're trying to achieve. So these 4 sections are the statement of intention, and while this is should definitely appear first in your folio, it's probably something that you're going to write a little bit later. Once you work out the details in your actual production, you might come back to this to really work out what it is that you want to achieve. The second and absolute most important section of your folio will be audience. Audience is the thing that separates media from art. You are not making these productions for yourself. You might be making them to express yourself, but you are making them for somebody else, and that's your audience. So every decision that you make throughout the production process needs to have the audience in mind. So you really need to be able to identify who that audience is. Genre and style is something we've talked about before, and still it becomes a little bit confusing, but again, this sort of categorizes your actual production. And then finally, the synopsis and treatment, which is about the actual story. It's about the narrative. So the reason why these 4 sections are so important is because your folio, your production design, actually is only assessed on 2 criteria. And this is one of those criteria. So it's the documentation of the specified intention, audience, and narrative relevant to a proposed product in a selected media form. And if we actually have a look at how I'm meant to assess you on this criteria, it's broken essentially into 4 sections. Intention, audience, narrative, style, and genre. So where narrative is to us story, and therefore your synopsis and treatment. So you can see how these 4 sections actually carry quite a bit of weight when it comes to your assessment. Everything else that you will do in this pre-production folio, so storyboarding, script writing, planning out the details of costuming, lighting design, locations, all of those other details that is probably the more time-consuming part. All of those crammed together to fit the other criteria. So I do want you to be spending a lot of mental time actually considering these 4 sections. And of course, we're going to be aiming for very highs here. So the difference between how you get a very high from, a medium and a high, it is describing and elaborating on those ideas and making justifications. So explaining why you're making these choices. And as far as how do you justify your choices, it's always about how will this appeal to the audience. So making sure that you're especially elaborating on your ideas, that you're not just dot pointing. That's where we can get to a very high mark in this particular criteria. So first of all, statement of intention, and this is one that people do get confused about, and the thing that trips people up the most is they think they need to talk about the story, and that's not correct. So a statement of intention, when we think about our folio, you need to explain what the product is, how you're going to make it, and why you're making it. And the statement of intention really summarizes the what and the why. So what is the product? An example might be, this is a 4-minute music video in the future funk genre. It's not what the narrative is about. Okay, it's not. This is a story about a girl who can't drag herself to school until she meets a boy on the bus and he changes her life. Right, that's the story. This is not what the statement of intention is about. As far as the how will you actually make the product, the scripting, the storyboard, the shot list, all that sort of detail, that how stuff that will come later in your folio, okay? And that is marked completely separately. Finally, and most importantly, your statement of intention is the why. Why are you making this? Why are you passionate about creating this narrative? Why are you passionate about portrait photography or whatever it is that you are working in? And then finally, why are you doing this in terms of audience? What are you trying to achieve out of this? What is it that you want your audience to walk away thinking or feeling, having experienced your media product? And if you cover those things, your statement of intention will be really strong. So in terms of your intention, it really is about primarily the audience, but also about you. This is the section that you can actually talk about yourself a little bit. In a script, you won't be discussing the decisions that you're making. Here, it's about you and your vision and why you're deciding to do this. So if we are thinking about audience, which we always need to in our folio, the thing that I want you to ask yourself is, what do you want the audience to think or feel after engaging with your product? And in three really broad ways, we consider what an audience can walk away from any media product thinking or feeling. So our intention might be to entertain, to simply provide a distraction that is meant to humor them, an emotional ride where a horror short film might be to give them a scare. It might be an emotional ride in terms of showing a drama or a love story. It could be just to entertain them in terms of showing some really gorgeous landscape pictures and just take them out of the dreariness of their daily lives and give them that sort of escapism. We could also make media products to educate, and that's to teach the audience something that they want to know in detail. So a food magazine might have recipes. That's to educate, because the idea is that the audience would read those recipes and then would go and replicate that themselves. They've learnt something. And then finally, the other category, as far as what we want the audience to walk away with, is to inform them. To tell them something that they are not aware of. So this is different to educating in that it might be just showing them a new restaurant that's popped up in their neighborhood. That's informing. They don't need to know everything about that restaurant. It might be informing them about a particular political cause or charity or social movement. So you might have a feminist zine is intended to inform the audience about actions that are happening in their community. So they're the three sort of broad categories that we can label as to how we intend our products to be used by our audience. And so here's an example of a student's statement of intention from a previous year. I intend to create an 8-minute long superhero coming-of-age short film, which will be full of flashy animations, over-exaggerated violence, and childhood wonder. I want my film to capture through the protagonist Oliver's journey to become the mighty Jupiter Man. The wonders of childhood and animation and creativity. I will really play around with the comic book style of my film, similar to the type seen in Scott Pilgrim, and hope that through including fun animations and utilizing quick editing, I will create a vibrant energy throughout the film's entirety. I want my film to be a fun experience for my audience and make them feel as if a comic book is playing out in front of them. However, it's also important to me that my film is visually appealing experience for them as well. Because of this, my film will also adopt a Wes Anderson style, which I will replicate through the use of my camera movement, visual composition, sound, and colour. My film will have a certain aesthetic which will give suggestions of both childhood wonder and comic books, giving Oliver's world a distinct feel. All in all, I hope to create a film that will be loved and bring joy to all, whether that be because it reminds them of good old days when they were a young child dreaming about saving the world, or because the flashy animations in my film were really awesome. I want to create something that will leave an impression and will have people thinking about and discussing long after they've seen it. My intention is to create a unique and enjoyable experience for all audience members, which I hope by adopting the various techniques I've mentioned above, I will achieve. And so if we actually break down this statement of intention, it's got all those elements that we've discussed, and what it does is it sort of summarizes and gives signposting to what is going to be included in this folio. So things that are included in here are the what is it, an 8-minute short film full of flashy animations and over-exaggerated violence. That's what it is. That's not what it's about. That's what the product actually is. We've also got what the product does. So capture the hero's journey and the wonders of childhood imagination. So that's what the product actually does. It's not a summary of the story per se, but it is a summary of what the story is meant to represent. We also have genre and style labeled here. We're not describing the genre and style, that comes later, but we have labeled it and given suggestions as to what it would be. And then finally, and most importantly, this is the effect on audience. I hope to create a film that will be loved and bring joy. That is the effect that this particular short film is intended to have. And that's a really strong statement of intention. If we were to nitpick anything that could have been improved, it might be actually suggesting and summarizing who that audience is. It does say, whether they are, it reminds them of the good old days when they were young, which suggests an older audience, but just labeling exactly who they are would be really important and would make this an 11 out of 10 statement of intention. Speaking about audience, this is something that students typically find difficult, but it is really important. And the reason why it's important is because it does need to drive every decision that you make in your production. The difficult part that I find students experience is trying to be specific and trying to do that thing which is really awkward for us, and it's something that we are told not to do, and it's actually to label people, to generalize and to put people into boxes so that you can actually target them. And I know that's not the way that we see the world. I know that we see individuals, but when we see nothing but individuals, it makes it really hard for us to say who our media product is for, which then leads us to the trap of saying, oh, well, this could be for all people over the age of 18. And that's not right, because an 18-year-old boy is going to be into very different things to an 89-year-old woman. And so just because they might stomach your production, they might not be offended by it, they might not mind it, it doesn't mean that you should be targeting them. So a simple way of actually putting together this target is perhaps working from that really broad audience and working your way in. And something that I'd like you to show me is perhaps who those audience members are on 3 different levels. So first of all, we have the primary audience. They are the person who is in the absolute center of your target. That is the group who you are aiming at. Outside of that, you've got your secondary audience. Think of your secondary audience as those people who, wouldn't mind it if they saw your zine on in a doctor's waiting room. They would pick it up and read it, whereas your primary audience would actively go out and buy it. Your secondary audience might be people who, if they're flicking through the TV channels and saw your film, they would leave it on there. Whereas your primary audience would be the people buying tickets to see it in the cinema. And then finally, on the real outskirts is your peripheral audience. So they're people who might actually see your product but wouldn't necessarily be interested. And so to give you an example, we can look at the film Frozen 2, where their primary audience would be girls aged 5 to 9. And when we say that, it is a big blockbuster film, and certainly more people outside of that group have seen it. But the film is targeted at that smaller group, even though they know that a wider group of people would see it. I would actually even say that their primary audience is targeted further to girls 5 to 9 who have seen the original movie Frozen. Because without seeing that, they might be a little bit lost. So that is a really, really targeted audience. If we then think about the secondary audience, and this is usually what students think is their target audience, and it's not the case, because the secondary audience for something like Frozen does include those broader groups. So girls who might be slightly older, boys who are in the original target group. Of course, boys love Frozen 2 as well. General Disney fans of all ages would probably go and watch Frozen 2, or they might already have Disney Plus and be watching it on there. Because Frozen, the Frozen series has those strong sort of feminist ideologies in there, you might have feminists as a secondary audience, which of course would be people much older than the target group. So keep in mind that even though there are groups of people who would enjoy your product, they're not necessarily who you're targeting at. And then finally, your outskirt, your peripheral audience might be something like parents, who take their children to see Frozen in the cinema. They have to be in there sitting with them. And they'll have a little chuckle along the way. But if it wasn't for their kids, they probably wouldn't be buying the tickets to go and see the actual film in the cinema themselves. So that's sort of a small breakdown of how you might represent your primary audience as well as other people who would enjoy your product. But another really good exercise is to develop an audience profile. And think about, not only just who your primary audience is, but if you had to pitch your product to just one person on the planet, who would that person be? What's their personality like? What do they do? What sort of hobbies do they have? Where do they go to school, or what kind of job do they have? Did they go to university or not? How much money are they earning a year? Do they have, what's their relationship status? What is their gender, sexuality, religion, background, culture? All those things that might have an influence on your particular product. Paint a picture for me by actually developing that audience profile. So in terms of that short film that we mentioned before, the Jupiter Man, here's their target audience. So Harley, a young and imaginative 7-year-old boy who dreams of becoming a firefighter. Despite not particularly enjoying school, he takes joy in the class library lesson as he can borrow a new comic book from the school's collection, with his favourite character being a tie between Thor and Captain America. In his spare time, when he is not playing with his friends, he loves watching TV, particularly Marvel cartoons, and is also a fan of Star Wars and superhero movies. In the past, Harley was bullied by a boy in his class, but he was able to overcome it, and this struggle is the reason why he enjoys watching bad guys being defeated so much. The walls of his bedroom are plastered with Star Wars and comic book posters. So by describing that audience member, it becomes really, really clear who this product is actually being aimed at. And certainly other people might enjoy it, But this student has kept Harley in mind when she made decisions about what types of shots to include, what types of animations, what types of sound effects, what would really appeal to this one person. So that's a really good exercise for you to go through towards the start of your planning process, so that other decisions that follow can have this audience member in mind. And moving on to genre and style. Once again, this is a section that is easily confused by students. And the easiest way that I can sort of break it down is genre is the type of media product based on its structural qualities, or those things that we label under conventions. So how the actual narrative is set up and structured forms its genre. Whereas style is the type of media product based on its aesthetic qualities. It's the look and feel of it. And because of this, we can label different styles based on the typical use of codes rather than conventions. And to give you an example, if you're familiar with Wes Anderson films, you can spot a Wes Anderson film just from a single shot, because he has this consistent style of central framing, of using a muted pastel-y sort of color palette, by including quirky characters played by similar actors, and using camera to have these quite distinct movements. And so no matter whether Wes Anderson is filming a family animation, or whether he's doing an adventure, a coming of age film, family dramas, a comedy, or a romance, all these different genres, doesn't matter. He has his own unique style based on the look and feel, the aesthetic qualities of all of his productions. On the flip side of that, you can have genres that have very, very different styles. So if we take the genre of science fiction or sci-fi, for example, their one quality that ties them all together is it is a narrative quality, in that it is something that is usually set slightly in the future, or certainly something that includes a fictional, a made-up piece of technology or science that is yet to exist. And now that might be something really extreme, like spaceships that travel across the universe and run into aliens. Or it might be something just a little bit closer to home, but just one or two steps in the future, like with Her, where it is about computer artificial intelligence and how we rely on things like Siri. And yet you can even tell, if you haven't seen these two films, you can tell just by the posters that they are very, very different in terms of their aesthetic, in terms of their style. In a similar way, films that are even quite closely related in terms of their content, so time travel movies like Back to the Future and Primer look very, very different. And so style tends to be those aesthetic qualities that are consistent between films, and they are usually stylistic choices are usually something that we can associate with a director. For instance, Close Encounters of the Third Kind and E.T. Are both Steven Spielberg films, and they certainly both have quite a distinct family feel about them, and yet they both appear in the sci-fi genre. So you can have a little bit of overlap, but it's important to understand the significant difference between style and genre. And of course, that doesn't necessarily only apply to video and filmmaking. For something like photography with a portrait, which is a genre. Again, it has the same structure in that it features typically one person as the dominant subject. And yet we can see here a range of different styles, from Lee Jeffries to Maggie West, where the use of coloured lighting is really distinct to Maggie West's style, and obviously black and white is distinct to Lee Jeffries. But even when you compare Lee Jeffries' black and white to Platon's black and white, you can actually see that there's quite a bit of difference. We've got some overexposed lighting here, some underexposed lighting here. We have this really extreme camera angle and extreme depth of field, where former President Bush's hand is bigger than his head and almost the same size of his torso. And whereas here there tends to be a more flat and even balance in terms of the depth of field. So you can talk about the difference in style and genre regardless of the medium in which you are working. And finally, synopsis and treatment. This is the summary of your actual narrative of the story. Okay, where our statement of intention is what is the product. This is what is the product about. So a synopsis is a really brief summary of the story itself. It's often referred to as the elevator pitch, in that you imagine you have to describe your media product or your story, your narrative, to somebody in the space of time that it takes to share an elevator ride. And so you have to be able to explain an overview of what it's about in that time period. So for a film that we're familiar with, Iron Man, the synopsis is a billionaire industrialist and genius inventor, Tony Stark, is conducting weapons tests overseas, but terrorists kidnap him and force him to build a devastating weapon. Instead, he builds an armored suit and upends his captors. Returning to America, Stark refines the suit and uses it to combat crime and terrorism. That's the overview of what Iron Man's about. There's certainly heaps of scenes that we've glossed over. We haven't mentioned certain other characters that are significantly involved. This is the 30-second summary of what the story is about. Whereas your treatment is a detailed description of the narrative. It's essentially everything that happens in the film, everything that happens in every photo that you take, or everything that happens on each page that you write. Now, obviously, it's not word for word. You do not have to write out your script, or you don't have to write out the actual copy that will appear on the pages. But you are summarizing the details. And so an example of a treatment for a photo describes this mock-up that you can see on the left. A dancer will be in a wide squat position facing the camera and will be up on her tippy toes. Her body will be upright and her head looking up on a 45-degree angle. Her arms spread out like a star. The powder will be haloed around the top half of her body. She will express herself as being very determined to break the pattern. She is displayed in a strong standing position to demonstrate her growth and the power she is beginning to hold. So that's a really detailed description as to what's happening in this image. Now, I will say that for film treatments, for video treatments, you don't have to go in as much detail as this person has in their photography treatment, but you do have to make sure that you are summarizing what happens in every single scene in your video. And so that's the big picture stuff for your media production design. The rest of your folio will be dedicated to the how. How will you actually produce, edit, and distribute your product? How will you be appealing to that audience that you have identified? And how will you actually achieve your intention that you have identified? So This is where the actual planning comes out in terms of storyboarding, drawing mock-ups, planning a lighting sequence, actually planning out the layout of your print production, planning the talent that you're going to use and the costumes that they'll wear, the locations that you'll film at, what day and time and place will you be filming, what equipment you will need to bring. It is the how will you actually do it. It's the practical and the detailed creative side, okay? And this is weighted as strongly as what I have just discussed before. So keep in mind that you need to show that balance between the two criteria. Hopefully this has helped you to get started on your folio. Good luck.